in this case, obviously, the suspicion is that the thinking would have been as sophisticated on board a ship which basically had men of reasonably low education. But the premise of part of the premise of the Requiem shark is what happens. They used to capture musicians, and the deal with musicians in the 18th century was normally, if you were then in turn captured by the British Navy, musicians were always excused. They were never hanged. So my premise was what happens if you get a musician on board who is of a much higher educational level than most of the men around it, and is impressed by the captain in sort of second sense to start writing about him, because the captain, who's a man who sort of has a firm sense of fate and knows definitely where he's headed, is thinking about his posterity from the whole time. And of course the twists of the Requiem shark have to do with just how far our educated musician partakes in things that really he shouldn't be partaking in, and the lines that he crosses, and once again the levels of self-deceit, and but he maintains his innocence to himself the whole way through, but perhaps that's not how he's judged at the end.
Well, you are a born novelist in the sense that you are examining all these layers and layers. But my question is, how did a person prove he was a musician? I mean, did they give him like an audition on the spot?
Yeah, well, I think in certain cases you would want to audition on the spot, because your fate might be worse if you didn't. And yes, there was music was absolutely essential to life on an 18th century ship. I mean, every sea shanties, every single task performed on that ship would be done to music, whether it was sort of just a cappella singing in a sense, which makes it sound a little collegiate. I don't mean it in that way, or sort of sea shanties accompanied by fiddles at night. And so I think Mr. Williams in this case was very grateful to be spared the fate of some of his fellow sailors and the night that they're seized by Bartholomew Roberts.
Oh, but if that was well known, what a useful thing that would have been, a sort of in one's kit, so to speak, would be the ability to just fiddle a little bit or something, and you could save yourself from disasters. I mean, I wonder if Johnny Depp knows this. It would be wonderful. Well, then you wrote a book, a nonfiction book called Caucasus.
Yeah.
Now, did you have family history in Russia too, or what nudged you into Caucasus?
Caucasus was just, well, I had a friend who's a great documentary filmmaker, and he had traveled a lot in post-Soviet Russia, and he was always sending me books and telling me some of the stories, and I would sort of read them. And one day he mentioned, next year I'm going to be going on this trip. Have you ever thought of writing a piece of nonfiction? And I said, no, and packed my bags and went with him, and I had a year's advance notice, so by the time I went I had a pretty good grasp of the history of the regions we were going to travel through. But once again, even though this was non-fiction, this was connected to crime in one sense or another. This was about the clash between the expanding Russian Empire, expanding Christian Empire, and sort of the mountain area of the Caucasus, which was primarily either pagan or Muslim nations, or in that case not really nations, tribes, which then gathered around the banner of Islam, and you really had something that of course is incredibly relevant to today's situations.
So did you come up through time, or did you pick a particular strand of time? What did you do?
We picked, I suppose, what you would have called Russia's 19th century version of Vietnam. They thought they were rolling quickly through a reasonably small area around Chechnya and Dagestan, and they got in there, and 30 years later they were still in there fighting the same man. And this is a story about the history of that man and sort of the hunt for him, and it sort of weaves back and forth through what then happens again, where we have the same situation at the breakup of the Soviet Union. You find that all these things that we thought had been resolved 150 years before just spring immediately to life again, and you had Russia, who we always thought of as a fellow superpower, falling to a sort of stalemate and in every real sense of defeat at the hands of just a few thousand Chechen troops in the early 1990s, which was a big shock, but maybe not so much of a shock if you knew more about 19th century history, and that was really the purpose of my trip, to go and have a close look at these two independent wars and draw them together, because of course the second guy who coordinated the fight against the Russians in the 1990s was named after the man who had kept them at bay for 150 years.
Now, is the Caucasus a barrier between the Soviet Union here and the Black Sea? Down here, they've always driven for a warm water port, and that's been a big thing with Turkey and Russia over centuries.
Yeah, no, I mean the Russians had, well, they won their ports, I guess, all over the place in the end. But this was very much about trying to create a Christian bridge between Russia and Christian Georgia. There were strong relations between the two royal houses, but you had this sort of pagan and Muslim bloc that really geographically is just a really tiny spot. It looks very easy on the map, but the country is incredibly rugged. I mean, we now all know just how difficult it is to fight in places like Afghanistan by watching the news over the last 5 years, and this is very similar terrain.
And the Russians stepped into a similar situation in Afghanistan before we got there too, right?
Yep, and hey, the British did it as well.
They did. The Afghan Wars. I mean, right up there above the Raj, where I really ran into that first, and I'm trying to remember what was that large historical novel by, was it MMK or somebody that wrote it?
The Far Pavilions.
Thank you. Yeah, terrible movie. One of the worst movies I ever saw. Just so dreadful, but it was a very good book. I always thought that she should have ended the book and then written a second book about the whole Afghanistan part, because I thought it just got away from her. Yeah. But I thought had some terrific stuff to say about what it was like to try to do a border war, and how Britain tried to pacify it, Russia tried to, and then it's still going on all these years later.
Yeah, I know. We always tend to think that history's stopped, but it does keep rolling right in front of us. But
where are the Cossacks involved in all this? I mean,
the Cossacks were used as I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but they were sort of sent ahead. They were the advanced posse that sort of, I guess, the equivalent of pioneers really in America. They would send them to the steppe lands underneath the mountains, and the idea with the Cossacks was they really appreciated good land. They would build their houses, and they would identify immediately with the land they'd then claimed as their own, even though it really belonged to the Chechens and the Dagestanis, who didn't have a system of land, much as I think Native Americans didn't have the same systems and divisions of land. And that, of course, was a very good way for the Russian Empire to create these conflicts, which was then an easy reason to step in and finish off the job, or not, as the case became.
Have I been reading too much romance, or are the Cossacks the great horsemen? Don't I remember that they were absolutely famous for that?
The best of all horsemen, except maybe for sort of the guys they ran into now in the mountains, but they weren't nomadic. They did have their set.
Right, but I thought that one reason they were so successful at war and whatever was because they were really mobile troops.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They were superb on.
There's been a lot of interest lately in Genghis Khan and the Mongols, his own story, which is completely fascinating, and the contributions they've made that we don't even think about, like their version of the Pony Express, the courier service and modern banking and just a whole lot of things, because of the enormous length of their empire and the way they were able to traverse it and move goods across it with their skill with horses and whatever it was. And I always thought that the Cossacks were kind of like the European end of that.
I think
the Hungarians too, to some degree, I think.
Yeah, I don't know so much about the Hungarians. My favorite Genghis Khan thing is I was reading that he has a total of 13 million immediate descendants from his own.
Yeah, they've done some kind of enormous DNA thing. And the other thing I think is truly fascinating is that they have managed to keep secret to this day where he's buried. Apparently there's some really phenomenal tomb, and everybody knows that, but they've never given away its location. So it's one of those real potential archaeological discoveries that may or may not ever be made.